All right. Okay. Well, I just thought I looked cool with that, but nevertheless, uh, hello all, and welcome to this advanced talk on Tailwind CSS. Uh, my name is Anish George. I'm a lead UI developer at Thoughtworks. Been here for 5 years, overall about 8. My qualifications for this talk specifically is that I was able to build and architect an entire design system in Angular, which is used by multiple teams. It's in production at a client side. Also, this site that I'm using, it's a personal hobby site of mine. It's in React, and I was confident and happy enough with Tailwind that I use it on my personal project, right? Which, as you all know, is a big deal for developers, right? So why should you care about this talk, right? Tailwind has been quite a divisive topic, and maybe you're curious about it, right? Maybe you have to use it in a project, depending on situation. And at this point, there is a bit of feeling that Tailwind has pretty much won the CSS framework kind of context, right? That's been like the default coming up with a lot of tools that we are using. So it's worthwhile to explore, even if you don't agree with a lot of things that I'm going to show, right? What I'm assuming of you for this talk, that you're all good with CSS. There's going to be a lot of CSS shown on the screen. Not going to spend time figuring out what kind of CSS that is. Maybe you've tried Tailwind before, so I'll not get into the actual installation setup, those kind of things. I'm going to assume you've used some amount of Tailwind. We'll go into some fundamentals. And you're knowledgeable in either React, Angular, or any of the component frameworks, right? How it's going to go down? I have these slides on my site. If you want to follow along that way, it's using Reveal.js. It's a 2D navigation, but otherwise you can follow along here. Some slides have these callouts on the top left, right? So the first callout is UX basically says that information on that slide is more pertinent to your UX professionals. So have a talk with your designer. Some slides are very niche topics, so I've called out as advanced. Feel free to zone out during these. If I'm under time crunch, I'll also skip these slides, right? And some slides are completely subjective opinions of mine, right? And I can be utterly wrong about them. So, take them with a grain of salt, right? We've got a lot of topics to cover. I'll talk about some fundamentals, some anti-patterns. There'll be some strategies that I've used in production, right? And basically, this is not a full list, right? These are things that I found to be important enough that you work on them, right? Cool. So let's get to it. Fundamentals, right? So Tailwind is a utility-first framework, right? So what does utility-first CSS mean? It's not basically something that Tailwind came up with, right? It was there earlier also. So in utility-first CSS, what happens is you basically create very small classes. And for some reason, my mouse is doing right clicks. Ooh, zoom. Okay. Okay, screw it. Yeah, all right. So you create very, very small classes in utility first CSS. You don't have classes like BT and stuff like that, right? So here I have a class called text white, text LG, BG blue, and they map to essentially classes with a single CSS property value pair, right? And they are so small that you cannot have any kind of domain or even structural connotations to them. They are actually just a CSS property value, right? So those are called utility classes, sometimes called atomic. There are some slight differences, but essentially this is how Tailwind looks like most of the time, right? And just so that we are all on the same page with the examples that I'm going to show, there are a lot of snippets. I am going to explain these classes. These are going to be roughly the kind of classes that I'll show in the examples, right? So very quickly, anything with the text hyphen at start basically applies to fonts and text, right? Now, Tailwind has decided that after that, if a hyphen color name is there, so that applies a color, right? That's a color class. And there is also a case where there is hyphen LG. That this is like a size class, a named size class, right? So that applies a font size. Now, why did Tailwind decide to use the same prefix for both? I don't know, not a good choice, right? But essentially, that's how it is, right? Classes starting with BG basically apply a background color. I'll talk about this first. Classes starting with P. P is for padding. So you have a couple of classes. PX is for horizontal paddings. PY is for top and bottom. There is also BLRT for bottom, left, top, right. So P is for padding. M is for margin. These follow with a number usually, which is basically like It's called a spacing unit, right? So these are stepped units that you can configure in Tailwind. So we'll go over all that. And more interestingly, you'll see a lot of classes looking like this, hover : BG gray. So this hover : is called a modifier. So these are like Tailwind nuances. Basically, it adds a class, the following class, on the hover of that element, right? So the class it creates looks something like this. This is like escape to get it right. And then on the hover, it adds the background color, right? So there are a lot of modifiers in Tailwind. This is just a small set of things that you will see in the examples, right? So that's why I just got a small explanation out of the way. So how does Tailwind compare, right? So typically, of course, you know how the typical framework, CSS framework looks like. This is like Bootstrap, right? And this on the right-hand side is somewhat equivalent Tailwind for that, right? So in Bootstrap and other frameworks, right, you have individual classes which encapsulate full-fledged styles, right? So Btn completely encapsulates a style. Tailwind, of course, everything is utility and atomic. So when you think about it and step back, with Bootstrap or something like that, you need both the CSS and the HTML to author your design, right? So when you're writing the styles, you need both of them. But with Tailwind, technically speaking, you can just author everything through HTML, right? It might look ugly with a lot of classes, but technically that is what the capability it provides you, right? Now, of course, what that means is HTML is overloaded with a lot of styling, right? The machine doesn't have a problem with that. Browsers are pretty optimized for it. It can treat 100 different classes on the class property, right? It's bad for humans. We'll talk about how to mitigate all of that. But HTML is clean otherwise traditionally, right? And styles are hidden away. But more importantly, styles are co-located with the markup on Tailwind. So styles being co-located is something that we've been trying to do. And we do it with CSS-in-JS and all, but Tailwind also does that for you, right? Now, so this is more of what I figured out overall, right? So in a traditional Bootstrap situation, right? If you think of giving Bootstrap to a bunch of developers, the CSS skills that a developer requires mostly relate to layout skills, right? How to lay out the components correctly, flex, grid, all of that stuff, right? They don't need to often know how to do not actual CSS, but very specific CSS skills and all. But with Tailwind, what happens is because the classes are mapped one-to-one with CSS, right? You have to know your CSS. You should know good CSS to even think of doing Tailwind. So Tailwind is not gonna stop developers with poor CSS skills, it is going to stop, right? I said the opposite thing, right? But you get it, right? It's like a direct overload on top of CSS. Cool. Now, how does Tailwind overall work, right? Tailwind works on a configuration-based system, right? Tailwind has a config file. We're going to talk about this config file a lot, but I'm just going to show certain snippets of it most of the time. So you can set configurations for almost everything that Tailwind does. So here what I'm doing is I've set the colors to be these, right? These are the key values that I have. I have a set of colors: white, purple, midnight, bubblegum, right? And what it does is now based on this configuration set, only will Tailwind create your classes, right? So I can get a class called text purple. So it's gonna add that font color of purple, right? Now there is no blue color for Tailwind anymore, right? Tailwind doesn't understand blue anymore. It's based on the configuration that you provide. Tailwind comes with the default set of configurations, which is super wide, which you should not be using in production, by the way. We'll talk about how to modify that. But essentially, this is how it works. You have a finite set of values that can be provided to your specific class sets, right? So that is how it's slightly different from CSS. CSS developers can write anything, right? But with Tailwind, you are restricted to certain colors. So things that Tailwind doesn't understand is not going to generate the CSS, right? So colors is something that you should know. And there is a key called spacing, which is also pretty important. Spacing is, again, the stepped defined space values that it's going to use in padding, margin, width, height, and all the other places, right? Typically, if Tailwind comes with numbers, when you override it, you have the option of giving better items. We'll talk about that. But this is how Tailwind overall works. And of course, you have to know that these values are essentially the foundations of your design system, right? These are called design tokens, right? So your designer should be filling these up. Cool. And let me zoom out. Cool. Tailwind generates your CSS, right? So it is essentially a post CSS plugin. So post CSS, if you know, it's just a pipeline for CSS. It's a tool, right? So your source style sheet looks something like this. It just has some directives for Tailwind, right? And based on the code, like you have to give a blob pattern to tell Tailwind, okay, this is where my code resides. The classes that you use, only the CSS for that is generated. So here, for example, I've just used MB large. So it just creates the margin bottom of that size class, right? Everything else is ignored. So essentially my class list is very small, right? So it always generates the smallest amount of CSS based on things that you are using. So what this also means is the biggest problem with CSS, right? When you delete stuff and you forget to delete the CSS that lies around with it, Tailwind handles that automatically for you at build time, right? And that leads to a very standard strategy with Tailwind. What happens is, because your entire code base is built out of these small classes, which are going to be reused in everything, like all your components and all, your CSS file tends to be very small, right? And it actually caps out after a certain point. Your CSS file is not going to grow. You're going to use technically all the possible variations of that your design system is going to approve of, right? All the possible kinds of fonts, all the possible kind of widths, whatever, right? As long as you're very strict with your design system, your CSS file will stop growing after a certain point, but the application size keeps on growing, right? So, and that CSS file is cached by the user's browser. So you don't even have to worry about things like loading only the minimum amount of CSS required, or loading just the CSS required to show the components on page and all. So those are the kind of things that we worry about with solutions like CSS-in-JS and all. So those kind of things can be outside of your worry. Like, you don't have to worry about it. It's just a single file, right? And that is the quick version of Tailwind, right? We'll not do heavy-handed comparisons of whether you should use it or not. But now we're going to get into what are the things that you should take care of when you do end up using Tailwind in production. Cool? All right. Okay. So first, we'll get through some anti-patterns. Again, these are all my opinions. I found essentially two anti-patterns with Tailwind. One, Tailwind provides a directive called @apply. So with @apply, what happens is, in your own style sheet, you can have classes, and then you can say @apply and provide Tailwind classes, right? So what this allows you to do, at first glance, it looks like a good deal, right? You're basically reusing the classes that Tailwind is going to generate for you, right? And you're reusing all of that spacing scales and everything without, manually writing them again. But what happens is, right? And you use this class, of course. But what happens is, it actually kind of copy pastes the entire bulk of those classes into your class, right? You essentially negate all the advantages of Tailwind, right? You're not going to reuse the small classes. It actually copy pastes the contents of that within your class. Now your CSS is going to grow linearly with your application, right? So apply is not really a convenience construct, right? It has its repercussions. So you should be using it very sparingly, right? Reasons why I think you could use it is basically when you're writing very complicated styles for pseudo selectors and stuff like that. Tailwind has got some modifiers for pseudo selectors. I hate them, to be honest. I cannot bear writing after and before with Tailwind, personal scenario. But if you're doing very small one time of things and all, you can think of using apply, but you should be careful that you should understand that this is actually increasing your CSS code style, code base. And more interesting thing, Tailwind has something called an arbitrary value notation. Cool. So this is how it looks. So I've said empty hyphen brackets, and I've given an arbitrary value, like a number, right? So this is not a named value or spacing value that I've used, right? So what Tailwind does is it creates a class for that, right? And it says margin top 3 pixels, right? Of course, the first thing you'll think is, why can't I use inline styles for this, right? You can, but there is still an advantage for doing this, because if some other developer in your team at some other points uses the same margin top value of 3 pixels, this will be a shared class, right? So Tailwind handles that for you. Why would you need arbitrary values? One good example is this, right? So this is basically a font icon, right? It's a font or some icon in front of a search text, right? So if you know about aligning icons with text, it's a hard problem, right? Each icon looks different. You cannot just center align and be done. Your designer will say that icon needs to be nudged up a bit. And these are specific one-off cases where you want to use arbitrary value notation. But Tailwind also supports crazy things like this, right? Dude. I should have bought my mouse. Okay. Look at this. This is an arbitrary value notation for a box shadow, right? I will reject a PR that comes with this, right? There is no reason this should be there in your code. This is almost a code smell, right? Why do you have a one-off box shadow looking like this? This is not maintainable. People are gonna copy paste this all over. Developers copy paste, like they love copy pasting. This is gonna ruin your code base, right? This should be part of your design system, or something is wrong at your setup, right? So be very careful with arbitrary value notation. Yeah, cool. So those are the two anti-patterns. Now we'll talk about configurations, right? So how do you, time check. How do you do configurations in Tailwind? There are two strategies essentially. You can extend your Tailwind's configuration, okay? So you have extend keywords, you can look up the docs how you do it. But essentially what I'm doing here is I'm adding purple and midnight to the existing color palette of Tailwind, right? This is a bad idea, right? The problem is that you're allowing your developers easy access to use non-compliant design, right? Tailwind, think of Tailwind from their perspective, right? They wanted to build a design system which was going to be approachable to a lot of teams, right? But that is not your design system, right? So they add a lot of values. Just look at their color scale. You don't need this rainbow of color scale, right? You don't need so many colors in your project. Like these should not be allowed in your project, right? So they have too many values for this, right? So you should not be doing this. Instead, you should be overriding Tailwind's configuration, right? So here I've overridden the spacing entirely. I'm just saying, yeah, okay, I'm going to have just 5 values, right? This is just an example. Overriding allows you to add, choose your own meaningful names for those spacing scales, stuff like that, right? Your own scale. So the earlier you move to these kind of custom sets, and this is partial overrides. You only override the spacing. Everything else is Tailwind default, right? So the sooner you move to these kind of custom scales, the better it will be for your project. And pro tip, get your spacing scale in order, right? I faced this issue in production. The Tailwind spacing scale is way too wide. So this is on the left, you see the spacing scale of Tailwind. These are widths according to that. The difference between a lot of these are so minor that they are inconsequential, right? A good spacing scale is more exponential. The bigger the size, the more the difference between the steps in values, right? Your designer can tell you this. So this is my spacing scale. I picked it up from a designer's handbook, just copy pasted it, and it works well for me, right? But the point is you should choose a good spacing scale. Cool. And one more thing that you can do, Tailwind is built out of plugins. So everything that Tailwind do, all the classes that it generates, like padding, margin, color, all of these are separate plugins, and they call them core plugins. And you can build your own plugins. The plugin basically defines how you generate the CSS for a given class name regex, right? And you can disable parts of Tailwind, right? So for example, here I've disabled the float plugins because you are not supposed to use floats these days, right? There is only a magazine layout where you should be using floats. Otherwise, floats have no purpose in modern CSS, right? And this is just an example. I've said, do not use Z-index. So the thing is, Tailwind will not generate classes for that, and developers cannot use those classes. Of course, they can write their own styles, but that's beside the point, right? In fact, you can completely disable all the plugins of Tailwind and use Tailwind's engine as a runner for your own plugins and have your mini Tailwind built out with like that, right? So that's also possible. But the recommendation is to prune out the CSS that you're never gonna need by disabling those core plugins. Cool. Now, before going ahead, I'm gonna talk about an important part, right? Which is the cognitive load associated with Tailwind. Cognitive load basically means that you're adding on to your mental capacity that required in doing things, right? So with Tailwind, like I said, you need to be good at CSS to be good at Tailwind, right? There is no two ways about it. Even the docs, you have to be searching for the CSS property to get to the right Tailwind class, right? So a typical Tailwind developer is going to think in this terms, right? You're thinking the CSS, okay, I'm gonna add color, font size, flex, and all that. And then you're mentally converting it to the Tailwind classes because of course, Tailwind classes are already there built for you and it's like all the advantages, right? So we are adding mental steps to the development process, and it becomes very complicated when you have custom configurations also. So how do you deal with this, right? So I can suggest a two-step strategy. One is create components, right? Tailwind works best when you have a design system in place, where you have a componentized architecture in place, right? So even with large teams, what you'll see is like the design system is built by a few devs or a small team, right? They'll be the one handling the core Tailwind classes and building those components with those Tailwind classes. Most other developers, they just need to learn the layout classes, right? How to lay out things, right? And the second set, is that when you create these kind of what do you call it, foundation styles, and you've changed the tokens, right? You've changed the spacing scale. You should have good documentation for it, because Tailwind's docs are now partially useless, right? So I figured that you can do this in Storybook. You potentially have Storybook in your applications, right? And you can use that for components, but you can use also create one-off dummy components, right? So this is my Storybook, and I've created a foundation set here. And this is, you can figure out how to build this, right? Create small React components. And I've basically, this is the name, this is how my colors are named in my Storybook, right? So I've basically put the name inside the square to denote to myself that this is how the color looks. So for example, this means that I can say BG, RCP, accent 100 to get this color, right? So this is my color scale. I have contextual colors. We'll talk about that. And this is my spacing scale, right? So this is just a reference for myself so that I don't have to look through the code and mentally figure out do all the gymnastics to see what to do. So highly recommended that you have a foundation set within your Storybook describing how you are doing your design tokens. Cool. Why am I getting? One second, let me just kill off Gmail. It's sending me notifications even though I'm on silent. Okay. Cool, but this is not a silver bullet, right? That cognitive load is still going to be there, like every other CSS framework that you use, right? Developers will adapt to it, they'll learn it, but you should be wary of that. At start, it takes some time. Now, how do you manage styles in Tailwind, right? Biggest thing that developers are afraid of. Like, look at this, right? You've got CSS classes off into the sunset, right? That's not how you can manage your code base. So, like everything else, right? We are developers, we can manage those things, right? So first strategy is obviously manage the strings, manage them as strings in JavaScript, right? Your class list can be strings in JavaScript. And these JavaScript files can be part of the glob pattern that Tailwind looks for, right? So all of that you can set up. Most important thing to note here is that you cannot break up a Tailwind class. For example, text2l is for a font size class. If you be smart about it and say, I'll put text in a variable and put 2xl in a variable and join them, it doesn't work, right? Tailwind essentially brute force regexes through your code base to figure out classes that it wants to generate, right? So you have to do a bit of duplication, keep these together. Rest all you can figure out, right? You can build your own classes to join previous classes with space and all the classic utilities like create variants, pick from an object, right? All of this normal everyday developer stuff to reduce your load of duplication, right? Of course, this works pretty well in React. It works passably well in Angular, because in Angular, getting strings of classes into the template is a pain, right? You have to put it in the class property and then get it to the template. So that's anyway a theme, like most of Angular development is a pain, sorry. That's coming from me who's been doing Angular for years, okay? Of course, the main strategy is to create components, right? You should have a strong component system, right? This is an example component React. I might be screwing up the prop types here, but essentially you create these small components, which all they do is just be the style, right? It's almost like style components, right? So I've designed a simple card component, which adds the Tailwind classes and forwards any other classes that the callee is using, right? In Angular, I can strongly recommend not to use components most of the time, because Angular, again, forwarding props in Angular components is a pain. Angular introduces its own tags. What I can recommend is using directives, right? Directives attached to host components, and you can use host binding class to add class. This works beautifully well. This is how I've designed the Angular Angular design system with Tailwind at my project, right? This is much more scalable, to be honest, right? Now this looks already better. And as you can see, right, it's just layout classes that we are looking at now, right? It's all widths and like some paddings and all of that stuff. Cool. Do I have time? Okay, this is an interesting bit that I've learned recently, which I wanted to share. What if we want to have best of both worlds, right? So you know how you create components for typography, right? Heading 1, heading 2, text, and all of that stuff. Now, typically, you want to use those components, but oftentimes you also want to use those styles in a non-component fashion. You might want to have heading 1 styles for an entire div or a bunch of components and all. So then what do you think, right? You'll say, okay, I'll keep those classes in a string and then import it in both places and I'll use that, right? But now the ownership of that classes becomes like dicey, right? Developers might just be using the strings everywhere and not using the component, right? So better approach is to do something like this. So here I've created a class, a React function, heading one. But more interestingly here, after the function is defined, right, I add a property to the function object in JavaScript. Pankaj is already smiling, right? And I add the classes there. So within the component, you can do this. This is completely legal, even though awkward looking. You can do this, right? And even TypeScript is okay with this. This is written in TypeScript. Okay, complete support for this, right? What it allows you to do is, of course, use the component nicely, and this gives you the heading one tag, or somewhere you can actually do heading one dot classes, right? Now this slightly nudges your developers that, okay, this is actually a component, you should be using the component. But if not, you can use the classes. And the ownership of that style is still with heading one, right? Pretty nifty code. I really like this kind of code. This is what I use for my current website. Cool. All right. So the main part of Tailwind is plugins. And we're going to spend a bit of time talking about how to build your own plugins and why plugins are powerful and why you should be using them. Okay. Now, before getting into plugins too much, one thing I need to talk about is the @layer directive, right? Tailwind provides an @layer directive. So within a Tailwind style sheet, right, you have these. You will always have these. These basically says that, put the components of Tailwind here, put the base, which is like resets and all here, and put the utilities, bunch of things here. So @layer looks like CSS layers, right? So it says @layer component. So all of your styles within this will be placed after the components in Tailwind, right? Like Tailwind is going to put them in the right spot. So here, as an example, I've created some layout classes, right? I do not like the grid utilities in Tailwind because I use grids as custom most of the time, right? I have my own grids most of the time. So I've created 2 layout classes. Now, why would you use the layer, right? And before everything, you should know that layer only works within the same style sheet where your Tailwind directives are defined because of post CSS. You cannot use it in a separate style sheet which is separate, okay? So why would you use directives? Layer. The most interesting thing is classes added to the layer behave and integrate with Tailwind well. So those classes will only be outputted in your style sheet if you're using the classes in HTML, right? And they also work with the modifiers, right? So here I've used it with a modifier called LG. LG in Tailwind basically is a media query modifier. So this class applies only when the large desktop is applicable, right? So it is worth your time that if you're adding custom CSS, put them in layer with Tailwind, right? So it integrates with Tailwind nicely. It's pretty nifty. Cool. So that's your @layer, right? Now talking about plugins. Plugins have an API. You have a way of doing things. You can look at the docs. We're going to talk about a couple of different styles of plugins and why you should be using them. Cool. Okay. So here is a simple plugin. So I've created a plugin for typography. I'm saying add base. Add base basically means it's a base style plugin, like base components utilities. I'm defining these classes, right? Typo H1, typo H2, and I'm plugins basically use CSS-in-JS syntax to define the styles for it, right? Font size, and plugins allow you to pick up things from the theme configuration, right? So this is how you do it. It's a weird way with strings and all, but it is what it is. And you can, of course, do your own thing, right? Do your own CSS. Now, this plugin looks very similar to the layer thing. You've basically created your own classes. And this, again, works the same way. It merges with the Tailwind modifiers, and Tailwind will take care of using these, outputting the CSS only if it is used, right? So this is the direct duplicate of how you do it in layers, right? So this is a very straightforward, simple plugin. Plugins get interesting when you want to create your own modifiers, like the LG colon, right? You can create your own modifiers. Now, I never had to create my own modifier, but I did have to update a modifier that Tailwind provides, right? So this code is pretty good. If any of you are Angular folks, you can just copy paste and use this code as it is. You'll thank me later. So what is happening here is I've updated the invalid modifier in Tailwind. So this invalid modifier applies the class if the element is invalid form element, right? But in Angular, when you're creating custom form controls, Angular has a slightly different strategy. It adds ng invalid, ng touched, ng classes to it. So what I wanted to do was use the invalid modifier with Angular custom form controls as well, right? So this is the code that does that. Like it updates invalid so that it also works when Tailwind is going to assume a item is invalid if these two classes are added to it, right? So this works, again, very beautifully in Angular. And of course, this also supports the existing one. So you can do things like this to make your life very easy, right? So, and I'll not explain this. This is just there for completion. You can look up peer and group stuff in Tailwind. But if any Angular dev wants it, I just want to keep the code entirely here, right? And this is how you use it. Like There's a custom form control, and I've said invalid ring red 500, right? Whatever that is. Cool. So you can create your own modifiers, and again, advanced plugins. There are match plugins where basically you can add custom sets within your Tailwind configuration. So I've created a new layout set. This does not exist in core Tailwind. And I say like, this is how layouts are master and stacked. This is like a JavaScript configuration. And you can have match style plugins, which basically allow you to convert from that value to CSS, and Tailwind does the rest, right? So it's going to create layout-master and layout-master stacked kind of classes with it. I'm not going to explain it too much, but essentially you can use Tailwind configuration to run your plugins as well, right? So it's a more programmatic way to do it. I've never found the use for it very strongly because you can anyway do programmatically, but it's there. So at the end of the day, what are you going to use? At layer styles or plugins, right? Because most of plugins behave very similar to that at layer, right? So I would recommend that if you're in a single application setup, right? It's just one application and you're creating simple plugins, use at layer, right? It's just pretty straightforward and it's there in your CSS. But if you are in, for example, a mono repo, right? And you are building a style system for multiple applications which need to be shared, sharing CSS becomes a bit more iffy, right? Sharing Tailwind configurations, it is actually quite easy. They have a preset system. Again, you can look up the docs for that. You can actually share Tailwind configurations across multiple projects, right? So for that, plugins becomes a much more powerful and easier alternative, right? So that way, I would recommend using plugins. The time. Okay. Cool. Now, next two topics would be about colors, because colors are one of the most important things that you're going to screw up in Tailwind, to be honest, right? So the problem with plain colors, right? Look at this, like, so we've defined colors in hex codes. These are of course inflexible and these cannot change in runtime. And quickly colors, configurations follow a nested structure, right? So this is going to create a color called primary, which would default to this, and then primary hyphen light, which would be this color, and primary hyphen dark, right? That's how Tailwind defines the configuration for it. You cannot change this in runtime for theming effects and all of that stuff, right? So how do you do it, right? And before we go any further, use HSL color syntax. Do not use hex, right? HSL is much more human readable. Hex has no place in the world. Use HSL, right? And I'm going to use HSL going forward. And you should be aware of the modern HSL syntax, which is HSL space separated list. First is the hue. Second is the saturation, lightness percentage. Then optionally, you can put a / and then you get the alpha value, right? You don't need to use the HSL-A anymore, right? So this is the modern HSL syntax. You should be using this for everything. You should not be using hex codes, right? Hex codes are good for copying, but you cannot do anything else with them. Cool. Now, how do you make Tailwind more flexible for colors? Use CSS variables, custom properties, right? If you have not been using CSS custom variables, please learn them. That's the best thing that CSS has ever put out. You should be using them yesterday, right? This is like really cool stuff. So essentially, you can use CSS variables at your root, which is your HTML, right? And in Tailwind, right, if you just plonk in a var syntax like this of the CSS variable, right, Tailwind is just going to work with that. So wherever there's a background color of this, is going to put in the var declaration of that, and it's going to use the CSS variable. This works pretty nicely, right? And if you want a bit more flexibility, slightly advanced, you can use a fallback syntax. So what I'm doing here is that as a fallback, I'm using a core theme color, right? But if the user has defined this in their style sheet, right, they can do the override. So this allows you to do white labeled applications, right? You have your core theme, but user can override specific values of that theme through their style sheet. Cool. So this you can use, becomes a bit more hectic. One of the things you should know about is that Tailwind has an opacity modifier on colors, right? So you can do something like this, BG primary dark /30. So this basically adds an opacity of 30% to that color, right? This is a very niche thing that, and of course, this will fail with our color variable setup, right? There is a way around this. You can look up the docs. There is a different way of doing the variables. But my thing would be that it is actually quite debatable whether you want opacities in your colors. Like whether you want developers to be changing the opacities. Like opacities ideally should be hard baked into your colors. That's up to your designer, right? So if you need it, look up the docs how to do this, right? I had the example, but I am gonna skip it, right? For now, too much on that. And Then biggest is dark mode, right? And for the dark mode, we'll go to dark mode, right? So how do you do dark mode in Tailwind? No, not a good idea. Too much light here on the room. Sorry about that. Cool. So how do you do dark mode in Tailwind? Tailwind has full support for dark mode. There is a dark mode property that you can enable for class, right? By default, it picks up system scheme. And what you do is essentially add a class of dark to HTML. You know how to do this. And when that happens, what you have to do is, in every place where you need something different for dark, right, you have to add a dark modifier, which is immediately obviously not scalable, right? You're not going to say dark mode. You're not going to recreate every component for dark mode, right? So of course we can do better. This is like absolute joke, right? So we all know how to do dark themes, right? We have a raw set of colors, and then we create contextual colors out of it, right? So my contextual colors would be like page far, page near, accent, neutral, and inverse text, right? And then I have the same variable name, but in dark scheme, it's a different color, right? We know how to do this. And that's very easily achievable with variable setup, right? So these are the variables that I use. I have a prefix for all my colors because so that I can differentiate between colors and something else. So I have my raw colors, and then in root, I have my contextual colors for page far. It references the raw color. And in dark mode, I have a different contextual color for the same thing, right? And the Tailwind configuration becomes very simply the contextual color variable reference, right? This works pretty well for your dark mode. This is how I do it. And now you don't need to use the dark modifier ever again, right? Of course, you'll need to use it in very specific cases. This gets you 90% of the way, right? So highly recommended. Long story short, you should be using variables for your colors in Tailwind. Do not use plain values, right? Not scalable at all. Now, before we get into any further, the biggest problem with Tailwind, right, which annoys everybody, is essentially it allows all combinations, right? So if you remember the contextual colors I had, look here, right? It says text CC page far. Page far was supposed to be like a background color for a page. It's not a font color for me, right? Here again, background CC neutral. Neutral was supposed to be a font color for me. It's not supposed to be a background color, right? Tailwind is dumb in that sense. It says, okay, you've defined 100 colors. Now you can get 100 font colors or 100 background colors, right? But that's not how designs work. That's not how your design is going to think, right? You have very restrictive sets of what colors you can use for backgrounds, what color you can use for fonts. But by default, Tailwind allows all combinations, right? So this is a problem, right? You can solve this by disabling the core color plugins, right? So I would say that if you're too worried about this, do not use the Tailwind's color system, right? You can solve it to a certain extent with your prefixes and naming of the colors, right? But if you're too worried, do not use the color system. You can build your own plugins for the specific colors and use that with restrictive sets, right? So that's about it for colors. And last topic, CSS in JS, right? Now, when I talk about CSS in JS, it's a permissive set of CSS in JS. Anything you do with JS when you talk about styling CSS, right? It could be any library, it could be anything or just plain, right? Now, why would you want to do CSS in JS, right? With Tailwind especially. So you might want application logic to manipulate CSS safely, right? Think about animations based on a scroll, right? Something like that, right? Where you're stepping through the animations using the design tokens, right? Spacing values. Maybe you're migrating to Tailwind from an existing system, right? Or and maybe you just want the flexibility. Maybe you still have an opinion that some things are better done without Tailwind, right? So maybe you want to merge the two. Now, Tailwind does have some basic support, right? There is something called resolve config from Tailwind, where you can get a config, the Tailwind theme config into your JavaScript, but this has repercussions, right? So you get a JSON structure for that. It adds Tailwind's dependencies into the client bundle, right? You can solve this to a certain extent by doing Babel preval and all of that stuff, inlining stuff. But this is there, slightly risky. You should be careful about it, right? But what if we don't want Tailwind to own our design tokens, right? This could be a situation. Maybe your design tokens are coming from a third-party build system where you're building multiple applications or something like that, right? Maybe it's a JSON file that you're just inheriting. Maybe you want to build a Tailwind configuration from that, right? Of course, you build a Tailwind configuration from that. Nothing major complicated here. You get a design tokens file, and then you can use that to build your CSS-in-JS adapters, and you can use that to build your Tailwind config. Important thing to note is if you're using an older version of Tailwind prior to 3.3, the tokens file needed to be in CommonJS, right? Tailwind configuration was always CommonJS. Now Tailwind supports ESM configuration files, right? So the tailwind.config file can be ESM. You have to put a setting when you initialize Tailwind. But more importantly, that if you're using ESM config, know that that Tailwind configuration goes through a separate build process within Tailwind, right? So it slows down your build ever so slightly, right? So you can do that, and you know how to create a configuration easily, right? Just programmatically build your configuration, not a big deal, right? As a bonus, if you're looking for a CSS-in-JS library that works well with Tailwind, right? Similar kind of philosophy, managing a lot of classes, no runtime, nothing. One thing I'm exploring is vanilla extract. That's what I'm using. I find the API very nice. Completely subjective opinion. You can go check it out. Not going to give examples, but pretty nifty library. Cool. Final thoughts. So this is probably running through a lot of your heads, right? I'm a CSS expert. I don't need Tailwind. Now, the next few things are verbatim copied from a Twitter person, but I felt this to be pretty accurate. Will your docs be as comprehensive as Tailwind's, right? Will your build tool automatically exclude unused styles? And will your dev team, more importantly, have experience with your CSS approach, right? So most often we realize that, I've done this time and again. We are often building our own inferior versions of Tailwind, right? So every time I start building a new design library, I go like, okay, now I need smaller classes for this. Okay, now I need shared classes for that. And you end up creating flex classes all over again, right? So I would say that do not think of Tailwind as a CSS framework. Tailwind is actually a framework to build your own CSS framework, right? The core Tailwind engine is very beautifully written. It is very powerful. The plugin system is super powerful. If you do not like the core set of Tailwind styles that it provides, you can just nuke it all out and say, these are the plugins I want Tailwind to generate for me. Just layout classes, everything else I can do on my own. And that still works out very, very beautifully, right? And this is something that even you can think of, you can build yourself, but Tailwind has anyway nailed it, right? So that way, I would say that you approach Tailwind, right? Forget about all the 150,000 classes that it provides and build your own, right? If you need to, right? And that's all for this talk. The slides are available at my site if you need to actually copy paste the snippets. This site is open source on my GitHub. You can look at the source code and look at all my really well refactored code and documented code, super documented code, right? So that's about it. Any questions? I hope I was on time.
There's one from Pune.
Yeah.
From Pune. So initially that you have told you have built a design system using Angular and Tailwind. So I've been trying to build a design system. Will I be able to do the same using Angular and Bootstrap and Angular material, of course? Or like, should I migrate from Bootstrap to Tailwind or just for ease?
Should you migrate from Bootstrap if you're using Angular to build a Tailwind design system?
Like from Bootstrap to Tailwind, like to just make things easier in the long term.
Yes, please. Definitely. Go for it. Okay. So the explanation of that answer is that Bootstrap is opinionated, right? So if your design system kind of matches what Bootstrap gives you, then you don't need to, right? But most likely, right? Designers, we all know, are the most opinionated people we are all working with, right? So if your design is opinionated enough, it's gonna diverge with Bootstrap a lot. And Tailwind as a system provides you much more flexibility. So if you're planning to migrate, 90% of the time, like 90% chance, it's a good idea. Go for it.
A question from Coimbatore. How Tailwind knows which CSS needs to exclude?
What to exclude?
Like you said, like Tailwind during compile time, it's excluding unused CSS, right? How it knows?
So technically speaking,
we are adding CSS class based on the input we are receiving and using, right? So how it knows like CSS? Yeah.
Correct. So first of all, it's not excluding unused styles. It actually generates the used styles. So there's a difference. Okay. So only the classes that you use in your code base, it will generate the styles for that. It knows how to generate styles through the configuration. All right. Now, in the Tailwind configuration, there's a content property where you have to give a file glob of what all files are part of your source code, right? This could be HTML, CSS, JSON, any random files that you are going to use where you're using the classes, right? So if that file list is complete, it can accurately predict, not predict, it can accurately figure out the classes that you're using and just generate those. It's not excluding unused styles. It's actually generating used styles every build. Does that answer the question?
Maybe no. So if we get the data from API and rendering it, Tailwind don't know that.
Then you're in trouble. Then you're in trouble. So don't do that. So if you have HTML and all coming in from the API, right, with pre-built classes and everything inside, then you're in massive trouble. Either you'll need to have a dummy file with all the possible classes, or I think there was a way for, no, you can't do that. I'm very sorry.
Yeah. So this is
yeah.
It does most of the things at build time.
Yes.
And these things, they come at a runtime, right? If you have an HTML that may come from somewhere else, Tailwind cannot predict that. And that is the beauty of Tailwind, actually, that it compiles build time. And when you run it, you already would have known what you want.
Correct. So you need a runtime solution. Tailwind will not be the solution for you. Tailwind is a pure build time solution, absolutely optimized for that.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
But that would still work for SSR, correct?
Sorry?
Was there something from Pune office?
Yeah, just on top of the last question. So even if it is a built-in solution, if I'm on an SSR app, correct? So the built-in removal of styles or generation of used classes only will work with SSR as well, correct?
Yes, it works. Yeah, I have Tailwind running with Remix. Works beautifully. Yeah, it works with Next also.
Question from Gurgaon.
We have one last one from Gurgaon. So if while migrating, like including Tailwind in existing applications, we generally by default have Bootstrap. So is there some risk of running them together? Can they coexist?
Good question, actually. So if any of the Bootstrap classes look like Tailwind classes, right? So your Tailwind is going to generate those extra styles. That's the only risk. Otherwise, I don't see a risk, to be honest.
I think, Anish, if I'm correct, you can prefix all Tailwind classes with some prefix.
Yes.
Right? That way you can.
Yeah, there is a prefix. There's a prefix configuration also. Correct. Pankaj and Ravindra are right on that. So you can do that, and you can completely make sure you're not conflicting.
Do something -tw and then empty3. So that would mean Tailwind, that is your prefix, margin top 3. And then once you know from your code that you don't have any TWs, you can safely remove Bootstrap.
Okay, then,
We have one question here. Yes. How to deal with appearances? Like when you install Tailwind, right? It goes like it wipes out every appearances on Mozilla, so whatever that particular browser provides. How to deal with those situations? Correct? No, appearances. For example, we use a button, right? Button has appearance on the Chrome, and it looks different on Mozilla. How to deal with that? Because it wipes out.
Yeah, Tailwind has a reset style on it. It just nukes out all core styles. So the base at Tailwind base, right? It adds reset styles, not normalize. So yeah, that's a choice that Tailwind made. So after that, you add the utilities. Now, if you with plain Tailwind, if you write an HTML code, right, it's going to look bad. Nothing's going to do. You need to add everything to each button, each everything, right? So that's why you need a ton of classes, and that's why you need the components.
There's one last.
Okay. So this is more of a sub question to the previous question. But what if your project has this beautifully written like CSS file and there's decent structuring? Can't we use that one to like get some of the things sorted? Because CSS has some beautiful features like mixins for like loops and that thing, which will generally cut down your boiler template for CSS.
Yeah, of course. Like you can do all of that, right? You can create your own utility first system using SCSS. Nobody's stopping you. What Tailwind gives you is a configuration driven approach to that, and an automatic guarantee that if you're not using a certain configuration based style, we're not going to generate classes for you. With SCSS, no matter what you do, you'll still face the problem of CSS being decoupled from your HTML and figuring out what is the CSS which is loose, right? So there are, of course, your linters and all that you'll have to configure. You can the Tailwind is not groundbreaking in that regard, right? It's not something brand new. Like these are problems that people have solved in various ways over time, right? Tailwind is just a consolidated, nice engine to do it cleanly and in a modern fashion, right? That's all there is to it. So if you have a good solution in CSS, completely go for it, right?
But the problem is from the designing the colors that I'm trying to implement are there are a wide range of colors. I mean, I don't easily find them in the Tailwind thing. So anyways,
yeah,
I have to build it from ground now.
Yeah, so the color problem is going to stay a problem. You and your designer should be essentially lock yourselves in a room and figure out a solution to that. And then based off that solution, right, figure out a solution to your code problem, right? I cannot really recommend a single way. Like for example, the contextual styles that I was talking about, that's just one layer of contextual styles. If you look at something like Atlas Kit, right, they have a much deeper understanding of contextual styles and they're very particular about the design tokens. That cannot be modeled in Tailwind, right? At least to my understanding, right? So figure out what you and the designer is comfortable in terms of color systems, and then figure out if Tailwind can support, right? Mine was just an example. And like I mentioned, if it's any more complicated, don't use Tailwind's style.
Hashtag styles as well, the color codes, the material uses. I don't know how to manage that in Tailwind.
Use HSL. Make sure your designer is giving in HSL. Don't forget hex. HSL at least is human readable. There's a lot of advantages.
There is also a new format called HWP. Have you heard of it?
So essentially, I'm waiting for LCH. LCH is going to be the best thing that ever graces in terms of colors in CSS, but that's just in Safari for now. For now, I feel like HSL is good enough. Any more esoteric, I have not felt the use for. Honestly, I'll check it out, but I'm not sure.
That's all, folks.
Cool. Awesome.
One question from Chennai, guys.
Yeah, so you told you component, right? So I have a doubt, will you be exporting the Tailwind configuration when you are developing the components, style components, or just the post-build styles? Why I'm asking is I also build the component for our internal organizations so that what I benefit when we are exporting the Tailwind configuration, right, it can be goodly integrated with the, your IDE, so that we don't need to remember all the pre-built CSS. Let's say I have the custom CSS. It has been prefixed with something. It totally collapsed with that IDE integration. So are you, or else, what's your thought process on exporting the Tailwind configuration when building a component?
So, okay, so you have to not export the Tailwind. So the Tailwind configuration, you have to use a preset mechanism. So every project, right, should have its own Tailwind configuration because the content field would be different. The source files of that particular project would be different. But you can, there is a preset mechanism in the Tailwind configuration where you can say preset and import a different Tailwind configuration. So that would be your core configuration, which is exported from the design system, right? And that works pretty well. Even IDE is supported very nicely. I've had no problems with autocomplete and all. So you check out the preset mechanism. That's how you will share Tailwind configurations across projects. There'll not be a single configuration. It'll be every project has its own configuration, but they use the same preset.
Yeah, exactly. We are doing that way. So I just thought for what's a suggestion, not sure that whether the most of the libraries will export that Tailwind configuration because it's tied with that source code. They only export the pre-build, post-build CSS. So
libraries will not be able to share the configuration, I believe. Like external libraries that you're talking about?
Yeah. Not an external one, but internal to the application. Let's say we have a
so here is how I did it, right? So I had my design system built out of multiple libraries, atoms, molecules, all of that. But there was a single library which managed the Tailwind configuration. I called it tokens or foundation styles, right? So there, the only thing that was happening there was just the core design tokens, and that was being used by everybody else. So individual atoms and molecule libraries were not exporting the configurations. You cannot merge configurations that way. Your core design system foundations is a separate